Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to recreate one of the most iconic Space Marine chapter armor schemes of all time, and that is the Retributors chapter from the Astartes TV series and the newly announced Astartes 2. Now the team at Siege Studios actually painted a replica of this armor scheme several years ago, and the scheme goes absolutely crazy whenever we post it online, and there's always people asking how to paint it themselves. So I've got my hands on the recipe and I'm going to show you how to paint it, and hopefully even better than ever before. Now, while we're going to be focusing on the Retributors chapter specifically, I'm going to show you the methods to paint any miniature in a box art style, so look out for all of the techniques and tips on how to do that. Let's jump into the painting. I've started by building the miniature in sub-assemblies for ease of painting, and I've attached each of the parts to some wine corks using some paper clips, and then prepped the surface by priming it with a matte black spray from the Colour Forge. And pretty much straight away we're getting straight into the secret sauce of this Retributors armor recipe, and that is a 5:1 mix of Skaven Blight Dinge and XV88 from Citadel. You can experiment with the ratios here, but I found that a 5:1 mix gave a lovely subtle olive hue to the grey armor and was quite accurate to the stills and captures that I got from the Astartes TV show. Now, as you can see, I'm applying this to the miniature using an airbrush and very, very thin layers built up over time. However, you can absolutely apply this to the miniature with a brush, just apply lots of thin coats as you always would, and really take your time to get full coverage before you get started with the next steps. Next, I'm applying Vallejo's Model Color Black to all of the areas that I don't want to be our armor color. This includes all of the undersuit ribbing, any areas that are going to be metallics, or anything that's going to be leather or any other color later on. This helps us both visually separate the areas of the armor to allow us to focus and be more neat and refined in our painting, and it also adds as a nice undercoat stage for those later paints, and it will help them to cover better on the model. Now we're going to add our first stage of shading to all of the armor, and to do that I'm going to add some glazes of Skaven Blight Dinge. I've covered glazing in our previous Emperor's Children tutorial, and this is going to be applied in very much the same method. I've thinned down the paint on my wet palette, and I've added a little bit of AK Interactive's Glaze Medium. The paint is a very, very thin consistency, and I'm just adding a subtle tint of this Skaven Blight Dinge in a downwards pattern on all of the armor volumes. It's important that you brush directionally here, pushing the pigment towards where you want your shadows to lie. So in that case here on the shin panel, I'm always brushing in a downwards direction. You might have seen that once I've loaded up my brush, I remove any excess onto the back of my glove. I do this so that the brush is still moist, but it is not holding as much total quantity of paint. I find that when you apply a very, very wet brush to the miniature, all of the paint wants to sap off and flood the surface, so brushing off any excess onto the back of my glove helps to mitigate this. The reason my glove is perfect for this is it's a similar finish to the miniature, whereas if you did this on something like a paper towel, it might remove too much moisture from the brush and ultimately leave you with a chalky finish. Applying these thin glazes is going to look incredibly subtle at first and might steer you towards thickening your paint mix. However, I would try to avoid this as much as possible and just be patient with it. It takes 5 or 6 coats oftentimes to actually see the colour develop, but that's what's going to give us that lovely smooth gradient and avoid any harsh lines or staining. Part of the reason why I like to use mixes for my base coats is to incorporate the darker colour for my shading stage, and that also allows you to get those lovely smooth blends for much less effort. One thing that I find is really helpful when working on the smaller areas of the armor is to have a hairdryer on hand so that you can dry each layer fully before brushing over it. I cannot stress how important it is to make sure that each layer is fully dry before brushing over it again, as that's going to agitate the paint and not only add texture but also staining and tide marks. Next, we're going to add a controlled, darker shade into all of the recesses on the armour of the miniature. And for that, I'm going to use the colour Rhinoxide from Citadel. You want to use a brush with a nice sharp tip for this and take your time to be as controlled and neat as possible. You might find that these recess shades are a little bit easier to apply with a slightly thinner paint than you are used to, but be careful not to over thin the paint as you don't want it to be flowing off the brush uncontrollably. These recess shades, along with subsequent edge highlighting, are very integral to the box art or heavy metal painting style, so you want to make sure that every single recess gets this shade and no area is ignored. It's quite time consuming, but the result is very rewarding, and this sort of painting is very great for developing your brush control and your brush skill. So even though you might not enjoy painting in this style, these techniques are very valuable to learn as they are going to improve you as a painter and translate to all other areas of your painting. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget that you can catch the full 1-hour masterclass version of this tutorial with tons of extra content showing you techniques and recipes for all of the parts of this miniature. So check the link in the description of this video for that, and you'll also gain access to hundreds of other PDF tutorials and video tutorials, as well as a whole bunch of other benefits. Now we're going to add our first edge highlighting stage to all of the armor panels using a 2-to-1 mix of Skaven Blight Dinge and Administratum Grey. In this painting style, you'll often hear us refer to this as the chunky edge highlight. The reason for this is that the subsequent highlights will be placed within this layer. So when painting this edge highlight, you want to make it about twice as thick as the thinnest edge highlight that you are able to paint. Bear that in mind while applying this stage, and make sure that when it comes to it later on, you can paint within about 50% of the width of this line. When I first started painting in this style, I found it a little bit tricky to make sure that this line was actually thick enough, because I had a tendency to want to make it look as sharp as possible. You really need to trust the process here, because we're going to add sharpness and definition later with the subsequent highlights, so be persistent with this and try to make sure that you give yourself adequate room for the later stages. One thing that's also important in this painting style is to make sure that the width of the lines are universal everywhere on the miniature. You want to make sure that you've got that solid, consistent line thickness and weight anywhere on the model, and in this painting style we're going to be edge highlighting literally every single panel with no area ignored. One thing we all learn when edge highlighting, at least early on, is to use the side of your brush. Now this is really helpful, especially for beginners and on sharper raised areas of the miniature, but you're going to find when highlighting smaller areas of this armor, it's actually going to be easier to just simply use the tip of your brush, working parallel with the edges as if it was a freehand line. Manipulate the miniature wherever possible rather than your brushing hand, and this is going to help give you the most control. It's part of why I like to have the miniature sub-assembled on a cork so that I can manipulate it with my offhand and make sure that my brush hand is always in the perfect position that is comfortable for me to paint with. I would say that personally, when I do make any mistakes, I like to clean them up pretty much right away rather than leaving them for later on, as they often tend to get forgotten, especially if they're in a less noticeable area. If you do make a mistake, for example spilling the edge highlight into a recess, I will stop, clean and reset my brush and go back to the previous stage to tidy up the area before carrying on. This can be a little bit slower, but in a way it does save you time later on, as you haven't got to go back over the miniature with a fine-tooth comb looking for any areas where you've made a mistake. It's just something that I like to do personally, as it keeps me neat and always progressing further with the miniature, and I haven't got to make too many backward steps later on. When edge highlighting these smaller areas like the helmet for example, you can see how I'm painting with the same line weight as I did anywhere else on the miniature, despite this being a smaller detail. Proportionally, it can look a little bit messier, however once again you really need to trust the process here, and it's going to give you that lovely heavy metal style consistent finish everywhere on the model. Now we're going to move on to our second edge highlight, or the thin edge highlight stage. This is the dominant edge highlight that's going to be the most visible on the miniature, and our later highlights are going to be much more subtle. With that in mind, you really want to take your time with this stage, as it's very, very high contrast, and the sharper and more refined your lines look, the better the overall miniature's finish is going to be. And for this stage with these Retributors, the colour I'm using is Dawnstone from Citadel. As I alluded to earlier, we're going to be painting this within 50% of the width of the previous edge highlight stage. That's what gives you that box art finish and that almost glowing look to the power armor and the edges. You can almost think of it like painting stripes on the miniature. These lines are running parallel to each other and are about the same width as each other. However, where one is brighter on the leading corner or that edge, it's what gives you that almost blended look. When applying these sharper edge highlights, I like to use a paint dilution that's slightly on the thicker side, and similar to when I was doing the glazing stages, I like to wick off most of the excess paint that's in the brush on the back of my glove. I find that this gives me the most control with my brush, but once again you really need to take your time with this stage. It's going to be one of the most time-consuming parts of painting in this style, and it's hard to get around, but the more refined you can be with your application, the better the overall look. Our next edge highlight comes with Administratum Grey, and I'm concentrating this onto the corners and sharp edges of the armour panels. Unlike with the previous stage, we don't need to worry about the thickness being any thinner than the previous stage. It can be the same thickness, we're just concentrating on placing it in specific areas. This is the first edge highlight stage we're adding that doesn't run the full length of the armour panel, and the length you choose to make it is dictated largely by the panel itself. So for on larger panels, you might want to make it a little bit longer. However, on the more concentrated and detailed areas, you might want to make them a little bit smaller and more refined. As a more advanced tip, you can brush this directionally towards the corners as well. Think about our glazing stage where we're pushing the pigment towards where we want the gradient to develop, so we can develop a much smoother transition by pushing this brighter stage towards the corner itself rather than brushing away from it. It's not something that I do literally everywhere on the miniature, however in some of the more focal points I do try to do it wherever possible. However, brush access can be an issue, as can your dexterity. Finally, to complete that box art look, I'm adding some small and refined dots with Vallejo's model colour white to the corner of all of the armour panels. This is one of those stages that I really struggled with at first when painting in this style, because I had a tendency to make the dots a little bit too large in their physical size. The reason you do this often is because you want to push the contrast, but the subtlety really is key with this box art style, and it gives you that really refined look. You don't want the dots to be super noticeable at arm's reach, they're just helping propel that contrast even higher. The actual application of these dot highlights is fairly quick, so take some time to consider where you are placing them and where you want to draw attention on the miniature, or where you think the armour panels might catch the most light. And with that final edge highlight stage applied, the armour of our Retributors chapter Marine is complete. So here we have the finished Retributor Marine. I really hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial and have found it useful in not only painting the Retributors Astartes chapter of Space Marines, but also painting Space Marines in a box art style in general. I think the techniques are really applicable to other armour schemes, so I encourage you to give it a go. Don't forget you can find the full 1 hour long masterclass version of this tutorial by checking the link in the description of this video, and you'll also gain access to a whole bunch of other bonus content, so you don't want to miss out on that. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.